Good afternoon and thanks for joining us. I'm Judy Simpson. We begin today's program with a walk through history. Vermont became the 14th state to join the Union in 1791. That's the same year that the University of Vermont was founded, making UVM the 5th oldest university in New England. More than a dozen UVM buildings are on the National Register of Historic Places, and those buildings are the focal point of campus tours that are held every Saturday morning. The tours are free, open to the public, and are led by a retired university professor.
So we're standing here in front of the old mill. This is probably the best well-known building on the campus of the University of Vermont. The building we see here is the second one on this site. The first one was built in 1806 and burned down in 1824. Just by chance, the Congress had at the same time invited General Lafayette to come back over to the U.S. To help celebrate the coming 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. So General Lafayette came to Burlington as well as many other places in the country, and he laid this cornerstone of Old Mill, and you can still read it, laid by General Lafayette, June 29, 1825. This building, as I said, was the second one. It was expanded in the 1880s by a generous gift of Mr. John Howard, of a well-known family who has contributed a lot to the whole Burlington area. And you'll see his bust right in front of Old Mill. This new building, constructed in 1825, originally had a gold dome. But when it was expanded in the 1880s, down came the dome, the roof was raised, and a big tower was constructed. And that tower, of course, exists today. It's the symbol of the University of Vermont. You see it on signage and letterheads and all over the place. This is one of my favorite buildings. It's the Billings Library building, completed in 1885. Designed by America's greatest architect at that time, Henry Hobson Richardson. Richardson studied architecture in Paris, France, and fell in love with medieval Romanesque architecture. And you can see that on the facade here. Very simple, powerful look of the Romanesque architecture with the half-circle windows as opposed to the pointed Gothic windows and so on. Coming down from the top, we see a very ornate version of the seal of the university dating back to the 1790s. And then we see two men's faces flanked by lions. Now, oral history tells us that these are portraits of the master woodcarver and the master stoneworker. And of course, they and their assistants produced the beautiful stonework on the outside, all the carving and so on, as well as the beautiful carved woodwork on the inside. In the apse of the Billings Library building, we see some beautiful examples of carving that Albert Whittekind and his assistants did. And they're connected with the rafters. If you look at the support of this roof, you'll see that there are 16 rafters coming down, and they split in two as they come down toward those beams. The part that's curving toward the center is coming to rest on some horizontal beams that are called hammerhead beams. And for those of you who have seen the first Harry Potter movie, you'll recognize this from the dining hall sequences of that movie. On the outer faces of each hammerhead beam are beautiful carved geometric leaves and flowers. Each one is different. So we've got 32 very fine carvings of decoration on these hammerhead beams. For me, the most beautiful piece of carving in this building is the fireplace and mantelpiece in this central space, all carved by Albert Whittekind and his assistants out of oak. And you see that there is the portrait of Mr. Frederick Billings on the mantelpiece. Mr. Billings was a native of Vermont, born in the area of Woodstock, and he, of course, is responsible for the very generous gift to the university that permitted the construction of this building in 1885. Probably UVM's most famous graduate was the psychologist-philosopher John Dewey. Graduate of the university in 1879, born in Burlington, just a few blocks from the campus. After he obtained his PhD, he did path-breaking research essentially into how people learn, especially children, at the University of Chicago. And he discovered something that we sort of take for granted today, that is learning by doing. John Dewey passed away in 1952. He had been born before the Civil War. So his life spanned pre-Civil War America all the way up to the nuclear age. When the second Mrs. Dewey passed away in 1970, following his wishes as well, her will instructed the executor to ask the University of Vermont if it would like to be their final resting place, which of course is a great honor. And that's why today, just outside the north wall of the Ira Allen Chapel, we have the resting place of the urns of Dr. John Dewey and Mrs. Roberta Dewey, with a very simple memorial stone. The Ira Allen Chapel may be the most dominant building on UVM's campus because of the very tall bell tower. It was a gift of UVM graduate James Wilbur, who was also an amateur historian. He did a lot of work on the life of Ira Allen, published a biography of Ira Allen, donated the funds for the very fine bronze statue of Ira Allen, which is located on the green, and then in the mid-1920s donated this chapel. This building also was designed by America's probably greatest architectural firm at that time, the firm of McKim, Mead, and White. Ira Allen sort of fell into obscurity in the 19th century. The university didn't talk too much about him. Ira had a very colorful life, had a lot of property ownership difficulties. He did donate the land, most of which now constitutes the UVM green in the immediate border. However, he wandered away from Vermont and ended up his life, unfortunately, in dire circumstances in Philadelphia, and is buried in an unmarked grave. He passed away in 1814. Ira did found the University of Vermont de facto, and we'll certainly not forget his name today, in part because we've got this beautiful building reminding us of his accomplishments.
The free historic tours are available on Saturday mornings. The university does ask for advanced registration, so please search for the registration on the UVM website or call the number on your screen, 802-656-8673. Our next segment looks at the university's herbarium, which is the third largest in New England. Rebecca Gollin tells us more.
Wes Testo doesn't have time to stop and smell the flowers. He's too busy collecting them.
You ideally want not just leaves, but either flowers or fertile leaves if it's a fern, which I often work with, or fruits, often bark of a tree, something like that. Additional characters that can really help you identify it and would also be useful to someone, 50 or 100 years down the road who come and look at this plant, because these specimens, outlast the people who collect them.
Testo takes detailed notes about how and where the plant is growing and arranges it in his press. Drying plants as quickly as possible is key to keeping their color and preventing rot.
You flatten the whole plant out, but you need to do so in a way that presents all of the possible important features of the plant. So you want the flowers to be presented, the roots, if you're collecting the roots, to be presented, both sides of leaves, so people can see the undersides and the top sides of leaves.
Testo will contribute his findings to one of the largest collections of dried plants in New England, which is located at the University of Vermont.
The first person we know about who collected plants, who was connected with the University of Vermont, was a man named Joseph Torrey, who coincidentally also got his name on the building we're in.
Dave Barrington is a professor of plant biology at UVM and the curator of the Pringle Herbarium, which is home to over 300,000 specimens of preserved plants.
And the primary goal of having the collection is to provide a basis for research into biodiversity, conservation of that diversity, and then various studies of what we call systematic biology, which is understanding the kinds of plants and animals, the way they originated through the evolutionary process.
While Torrey's collection of plants from the 1840s marks the start of the herbarium, what really galvanized the collection was the acquisition of the private herbarium of Charlotte Cyrus Pringle in 1902.
And Cyrus is perhaps the most colorful person in the history of the collection. At the time that his collection came to the university, he had in his own house in Charlotte about 50,000 specimens. We're in the fern part of the collection right now, and I open it up, and what I've got here is something like a couple of thousand specimens, each in their folders.
The collection here grows through gifts and acquisitions of smaller herbaria, as well as trading duplicates of specimens with other institutions.
We have some really exotic trading relationships. We have trading relationships with a group in northeastern Brazil, Taiwan, Indonesia, a couple of places in Europe. The herbarium in Denmark trades us Greenland specimens, and we trade with herbaria here and there across the United States as well.
In addition, the Pringle relies on botany enthusiasts to help grow and round out their collection of local plants. Barrington says those collectors include conservationists and hobbyists, as well as students like Testo, who's working towards a PhD in plant biology.
I do a lot of collecting for the herbarium, so I started that pretty seriously a little over a year ago when I moved to Vermont. And so I go out in the field quite frequently and collect plants mostly for my own research. So ferns that I am studying, I collect those, take a leaf or a whole plant, press it, and dry it, and deposit those in the herbarium for my own study. But I also broadly interested in the plants that we have here in Vermont, so I collect a lot of those as well, trying to learn to identify them.
Herbaria collections not only document the plant life within a geographic area, but also help researchers identify the arrival of invasive species.
When you collect a plant, you include the date on when you collected it. For example, Japanese knotweed is a really prominent weed that we have in the state. That wasn't here 50 years ago. Now it's all over our roadsides. So if you go to an herbarium and start to look at collections, you can start to kind of infer when this plant showed up on the scene here. So it looks
After the plants dry, Testo will hand them over to the Pringle, where they will eventually be mounted. When they are, there's a good chance that it will be done by Hilda White.
Newspaper over it.
And the plants come from all over the world. This plant is from Italy. We have a collector who's collected a lot from Australia and Illinois and everywhere. And we have many Vermont collectors, so our collection of Vermont plants is outstanding.
White has been a volunteer at the Pringle since 1998. She's mounted over 30,000 plants for the collection. What is it that makes a good specimen?
Well, see this one? It has flowers, roots, and it's pressed nicely so that it shows up properly. The flowers, the reproductive parts always have to be up so that a scientist that's examining this later can tell what it is. And they need to be dried fresh properly. If they're not dried properly, they come out black instead of green.
Like many who volunteer or spend time working at the Pringle, White is also an avid plant collector. Her passion is mosses.
Every year I go out to 1 or 2 towns and collect mosses. I've gone mostly to towns that have not been recorded very much because we really didn't know whether something was rare or not just because nobody collected it. And so for entertainment in the wintertime, I identify these mosses that I collect.
Once the specimens are mounted, they're filed into the large cabinets that hold the collection. As those cabinets are organized by botanical family in evolutionary order, proper filing is a task that might require a degree in botany just to figure out.
So this is one specimen, and this is what we have 300,000 of. As long as we can keep the insects from eating it and fire from burning it, Storage is indefinite. We have specimens in European herbaria that are now 600 years old, and they're fine.
You see these plants every day. It's nice to be able to know what the difference is between an oak tree and a maple tree, or between all the different kinds of maples that we have. But you really start to get a grasp for the diversity around you. So instead of just seeing a whole bunch of green around you, you start to see different grasses and plantains and asters and wild impatiens growing.
The Pringle Herbarium continues to grow and expand, an old-fashioned catalog of the world around us that remains relevant in our modern times. In Burlington, I'm Rebecca Gollin with Across the Fence.
There are ongoing efforts to digitize the herbarium specimens and data. A significant portion of the collections are already part of an online database. That's our program for today. Thanks for joining us. I'm Judy Simpson. I'll see you again next time on Across the Fence.